If you parade one more pink-cheeked heiress past me, grandmother, I shall mount my horse and ride for the coast, and you may marry her yourself." The Duke of Foxcroft said it without heat, which was the worst of it, for there was no satisfaction to be had in driving a man to shouting. Reuben stood at the long windows of his grandmother's drawing-room with his back to the assembled company, watching the lanterns being lit along the carriage sweep, and he did not turn. Behind him the house party murmured and rustled, 3 days deep into its second week, a tide of silken ambition that rose every evening at the dinner bell and washed against him until he retreated to his study with a book he did not read. "I have not the least intention of marrying anyone myself," said the Dowager Duchess of Foxcroft placidly. "I am 81 and entirely content. It is you who are wasting, Reuben, like a coat left in a cupboard." "I am not wasting. I am refusing. There is a distinction, and you have spent a fortnight pretending not to see it." He heard her cane tap once against the floor, a small punctuation, and he allowed himself the ghost of a smile that no one could see. She had brought them all here under the pretense of celebrating her own birthday. Miss Carteret of the famous fortune, Miss Holloway of the famous laugh, the 3 Linley sisters who were famous chiefly for being 3, and she had arranged them about the place like ornaments on a shelf and waited for him to choose one. He had refused brides in London for 6 seasons running. He had refused them in writing, in person, by the simple expedient of leaving the room. He had refused so many that the refusing had become a kind of armor, and he had worn it so long he had forgotten there was a man underneath. "I have invited a great many charming young women," his grandmother went on, "and you have looked at each of them as a magistrate looks at a poacher. It is not charming in you, Reuben. It is becoming a habit, and habits, at your age, calcify." "Then let me calcify in peace." "No," she said, and there was something in the word, a small private warmth, that made him turn at last to look at her. She sat very upright in her chair by the fire, tiny and beautifully dressed, her white hair dressed high and her eyes his own eyes, dark and direct, fixed upon him with an expression he distrusted on sight. It was the look she had worn the summer he was 9, just before she taught him to fish, having promised his tutor she would do no such thing. "I have one more," she said. "Grandmother." "One. And then, if you will not have her, I give you my word I shall never trouble you again. I shall let you moulder. I shall let the title pass to your cousin Aldous, who keeps ferrets in the house and cannot spell. You have my solemn promise. But you will meet this one first, and you will meet her properly, and you will not look at her like a magistrate." He should have said no. He had grown rich in the saying of no. It was the one currency he never lacked. But she was 81, and she had taught him to fish, and there was that warmth in her voice he could not place and did not trust and could not, in the end, refuse. "One," he said. "She is taking tea in the small parlour," said the Dowager Duchess, and folded her hands, and looked insufferably pleased. The small parlour lay at the end of the east passage, a room his grandmother kept for herself, low-ceilinged and warm, hung with faded rose silk that had been fashionable before he was born. He went to it expecting nothing, which was how he went everywhere now. He pushed open the door without announcing himself. A young woman sat alone by the tea things in the candlelight, and she was laughing. Not at him. She had not yet seen him. She was laughing at a small grey kitten that had got itself tangled in a skein of her embroidery silk, and now sat in a tragic knot of its own making, glaring at her with enormous offended eyes. She had set down her cup to free it, and she was talking to it under her breath as she worked the threads loose, low and amused and tender, telling it that it had brought this entirely upon itself, and that she had no sympathy to spare, in a tone that was nothing but sympathy from start to finish. The Duke of Foxcroft stood in the doorway and forgot, for the space of several heartbeats, every word he had ever prepared. The candlelight gathered along the curve of her cheek and turned the loose strands at her temple to copper. She was not the most beautiful woman in his grandmother's house. He had been introduced to greater beauties that very afternoon, and forgotten their faces by the soup. Her gown was a soft dove blue fine, but not fine enough to announce a fortune, and there was a small ink stain on the cuff she had plainly tried and failed to hide. She wore no jewels but a single strand of modest pearls. She was, in short, exactly the sort of woman the world arranged itself to overlook, and she was laughing at a kitten as though the whole of life had been arranged for her private delight, and Reuben found that he could not look away. The kitten came free. She lifted it triumphantly, and in doing so she turned, and she saw him. He watched her face change not into the bright assembling smile he had learned to dread, the one the ballroom girls put on like a bonnet, but into something quieter and far more dangerous. She did not leap up. She did not flush and flutter. She looked at him with a faint, rueful amusement, as though they were already old conspirators, and she had merely been caught in the middle of a foolishness she did not in the least regret. "You have found me out, sir," she said. "I was meant to be sitting prettily, with my hands in my lap, waiting to be admired. Instead, I have been wrestling a cat. I cannot think how I shall recover the situation." "I should not trouble," said the Duke. "I have seen a great deal of sitting prettily this fortnight. It does not wear well." "No," she agreed, settling the kitten against her shoulder, where it began at once to purr like a kettle. "It is exhausting to watch, I have always thought, like seeing someone hold their breath at a great length and being unable to do anything to help them." He came into the room. He had not decided to. He simply found himself across the threshold, and then in the chair opposite her, which he had certainly not intended, for he made a practice of standing in rooms, so that he might leave them the more easily. He sat. "You have the advantage of me," he said. "I do not believe we have been introduced." "We have not. Your grandmother forbade it. She said if you knew I was here you would bolt like a startled hare, and she went to a great deal of trouble over the kitten, so I did not like to spoil her arrangements." She poured without asking, and handed him a cup, and the small domestic ease of it, the assumption that of course he would stay. Of course he would take tea, undid him more thoroughly than any campaign of fans and laughter had managed in 6 years. "I am Genevieve Lacey. My father has a small estate that adjoins your grandmother's land in the north. We are not grand. I expect she has told you that I am her last resort." "She has told me," said the Duke, "almost nothing, which I now perceive to have been deliberate." "She is very deliberate." Genevieve Lacey considered him over the rim of her cup, and there was that rueful light in her eyes again, the suggestion of a shared and slightly absurd predicament. "I ought to confess, sir, that I very nearly did not come. I know what these parties are, and I know what I am not. I have no fortune to speak of, and I am 26, and I have an inconvenient habit of saying precisely what I think, which has been the despair of my mother for some years. I told your grandmother as much. I said, 'Ma'am, I am not the article you want. You want something younger and richer and a good deal more silent.' And do you know what she said to me?" "I cannot imagine," said the Duke, who was beginning to imagine a great deal. "She said that her grandson had been offered younger and richer and more silent for 6 seasons together, and had refused every one of them, and that this strongly suggested he did not want what he was being offered. She said perhaps he wanted someone who would wrestle a cat." Genevieve laughed again, low at herself. "I told her that was a poor foundation for a marriage, a cat. She said it was a better foundation than most she had seen." The fire settled. The kitten slept. Somewhere across the house the dinner bell would soon ring, and the silk tide would rise, and Miss Carteret and Miss Holloway and the 3 indistinguishable Linleys would assemble themselves beneath the chandelier and wait for the Duke of Foxcroft to choose. He thought of the great gilded drawing-room with something close to horror, and then he looked at the woman in front of him with ink on her cuff and a cat on her shoulder and her father's small northern acres and no fortune at all, telling him in the plainest possible terms she was not what he wanted, and he understood, with the sudden clean certainty of a key turning in a lock, that his grandmother had been right everything, as she generally was, and that he was very much afraid he had stopped breathing somewhere in the last quarter hour himself. "Miss Lacy," he said, "will you walk with me before dinner? The gardens are tolerable at this hour, and I find I would rather not return to the drawing-room until I am obliged to." She set down her cup. She looked at him a moment longer, and the amusement gentled into something steadier, something that took him in fully and did not look away. "I will," said Genevieve, "though I warn you, your grandmother will be insufferable. She will pretend she did not engineer the whole of it, and she will be lying through her teeth." "She will," the Duke agreed gravely, and rose, and offered her his arm, and was rewarded by the small startled pleasure that crossed her face, as though she had not, in truth, expected to be chosen, whatever she said. They walked in the long blue dusk among the clipped hedges while the house lit itself behind them window by window. He did not make her clever speeches. He had none. He asked her about her father's land, and she told him, with a knowledge of drainage and lambing that would have scandalized the drawing-room, and he found himself telling her in turn about his own neglected northern acres, the bad agent he had not the heart to dismiss, the tenants he knew by name and worried over and never quite knew how to help. She listened the way she had spoken to the kitten, with her whole attention and a faint amusement that never once curdled into mockery. By the time the dinner bell rang at last across the darkening gardens, the Duke of Foxcroft had said more true things to Genevieve Lacy than he had said aloud to anyone in a decade, and he was aware of a sensation in his chest he could not at first name, until he recognized it, with some astonishment, as ease. "They will all be at table," she said, as they turned back toward the lit house, "watching to see whom you sit beside. It is rather dreadful. I do not envy you the next half hour." "Sit beside me," said the Duke. She stopped on the gravel path. "Sir, that will set every tongue in 3 counties wagging by morning." "Yes," he said, "it will. I have spent 6 years being talked about for refusing. I find I should very much like, for once, to be talked about for choosing." He looked down at her in the last of the light, and he abandoned, all at once, the armor he had worn so long he had forgotten its weight. "Sit beside me, Genevieve, and tomorrow let me show you the north of my land, which wants a great deal of looking after, and which I have lately discovered I cannot manage alone. I had thought I wanted no one. I find I was simply waiting, without the wit to know it, for someone who would tell me to my face that she was not what I wanted, and be entirely wrong." The color came up in her cheeks, and her eyes were very bright, and for a moment the ready answer deserted her at last. "That," she said unsteadily, "was nearly a pretty speech after all. I am out of practice. It will improve." They came in to dinner together, and the whole long table fell silent, and Miss Carteret's forked halfway to her mouth, and at the head of the table the Dowager Duchess of Foxcroft looked up from her soup with an expression of perfect, serene, wholly unconvincing surprise. "Reuben," she said, "and dear Miss Lacy, how very unexpected." "Grandmother," said the Duke, drawing out the chair beside his own for Genevieve to sit, "you are the worst liar in England, and I love you for it, and you may begin planning the wedding the moment the soup is cleared, for I shall not give you the satisfaction of watching me pretend it was my own idea." And the old woman laughed a real laugh, delighted and unguarded, the laugh of a woman who had backed the right horse and known it all along and reached across the table to take her grandson's hand, and then the young woman's, and held them both fast in her small fierce grip. And the Duke of Foxcroft, who had refused every bride his family ever offered him, sat down to dinner beside the one his grandmother had chosen, found that for the first time in longer than he could remember he was exactly where he wished to be.